From an undisclosed location in the heart of the city of Detroit, this is your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, November 15th, 2023. I am Jer Stays, and across the table from me is
Norris Howard.
It's always good to see you on every Wednesday. And I, in fact, look forward to Wednesdays now.
Oh, well,
My Wednesdays were not the same without you.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Just here to help everybody get through the tragic hump day of the week and share some great news about our fair city.
Well, for sure. And today is definitely going to be an episode of what to know as opposed to where to go, because there are a pair of, I think, very important stories that we need to devote some time to, one by listener request, and one I think is so important and really hasn't been covered much at all, I think, in American outlets. Let's start with that because it is going to be near and dear to your heart, Norris Howard.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So there are now plans for Amtrak and Via Rail, so Via is the Canadian rail company, to do Chicago to Toronto service running through Detroit.
Yeah, this is a phenomenal plan. Now, this was teased a couple of weeks ago, actually, by the mayor of Windsor, Mayor Drew Dilkins. But now it seems like this is becoming much more of a reality. This is supposed to be a $44 million project that is going to link Chicago, Windsor, Detroit, and Toronto, creating one of the only corridors of international rail here in this region of the country. I think it is a phenomenal project. And really, honestly, $44 million does not sound like the massive price tag that it probably could have been had, the already existing rail infrastructure where Amtrak and Via didn't exist. This is a great step forward, I think, for the possibility of rail in the Great Lakes region and the possibility of rail in Southeast Michigan in particular, and connecting the two biggest Great Lakes cities in Chicago and Toronto with a middle pass-through of Detroit. I can only think of it as a positive thing.
Now, this is not a done deal.
Yeah.
So funding is going to be from Amtrak and Via Rail, according to a report first put together by CKLW over in Canada. And it's one of the reasons why I like to follow Canadian news, because you end up finding a lot of things that impact us. There are some steps that have to happen. One, of course, there is like that bugaboo that in some track sections you share with freight. That's going to slow down your service a little bit. Another thing is that there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to go in. You look at the documents and it says Michigan Central Innovation District. I don't think this is going to be at Michigan Central Station for a variety of practical reasons. It may be like right around the corner or right there, but the fact that Michigan Central is now a combination corporate campus innovation space, you just can't, like the egress of that and like the practical issues are a mess, but it could be connected to everything and you have to walk a bridge or whatever they end up coming with. I also think the timeline from experience, and I don't mean to be a negative Nelly here, the timeline from experience feels aggressive.
It is. They're talking about potentially starting this project in 2027, which sounds... It may sound far now, but we're talking about arguably a 5-year window for them to start breaking ground on a lot of this stuff. It does seem aggressive. This would be a massive project. Like I said, it's something that has not been done in the region. There's international considerations that have to be taken here. And so 2027 seems very aggressive, very soon. But ultimately, I think the biggest thing, unfortunately, I don't think is going to be an issue coming from the Amtrak side or the Windsor side. I think a lot of the issues are going to come, where does this stop happen in Detroit? Where do you put it?
I think it's going to be like right next door to Michigan Central, because the track goes through and the logistics of that. The other thing, though, is does that mean that we're going to have two functional rail stops? Like, how is that going to work?
That's what I mean, is that you already have the rail stop on Woodward and West Grand Boulevard. And listen, if you just got two different rail stops, that's fine. But, how do you get those things to sort of work in tandem with one another? That line usually goes around and goes up north. And then this line, goes through Sarnia and stuff like that. And this line is looking to go south through Windsor. So, there are some possibilities that, it's just a junction. It's not that big of a deal. But considering all the investment and all the development that's happening down there in Corktown next to Michigan Central Station, they are going to have to plan massively around Ford's new headquarters and having to plan massively around what is already going in place down there, and to not butt heads up against whatever development is happening down there. And then also potentially having to work with Ford. So that adds another layer.
I think everybody's willing to work.
Yeah.
It is from my understanding, and I've been working on some reporting for ourselves for this, but I'm at the understanding phase. And the reason why I say that is that this document I don't think was supposed to be made public. I don't think that this was fully baked for public release. I think that Mayor Dilkins maybe pulled the trigger a little bit early on the discussion of this one, because obviously it's a huge coup. It'd be huge for Windsor. It's important because Windsor and Detroit are such a huge freight hub. Them being a passenger hub would be a huge thing. Having the customs facility on the Windsor side would be a really huge deal. The other thing I would add is that, you know what, Canada is very invested in rail and all of those things and in infrastructure. Let's not forget that new international crossing, the Gordie Howe Bridge, that's Canadian dollars.
Yeah, it is. And, these are all things that continue to point in the direction that rail is kind of the way to go. Like, this is something that the populace wants. I think it's something that Canada, as you said, not only has invested into it countrywide, but they want to be leaders in it from a international trade point of view, from a tourism perspective. So I think this is all a good idea. Like I said, the only thing that I think could put some hiccups in this is just sort of the elements in the city of Detroit and the private investment side of it, dealing with Ford and a few other players there that could put some roadblocks into it. But ultimately, it's a good idea that may have been put out a little bit too premature, but still nice.
And I want to put a pin in the fact that this is not fully, like, there is a plan for funding, but this is not fully funded.
Right.
And so this is important and incumbent upon listeners or people who are interested in this to have their voice heard and to talk to people about it and push that this is something that you actually want, because that will help the ball go forward and help all the other leaders say, okay, we're going to get behind this.
I'm really excited to see how everybody feels about it, because especially in this show, we talk a lot about rail and public transportation and all that stuff. This is sort of the genesis of how a lot of that can start. And if this is fully supported by the populace and people use it, this is the big thing. You have to use it. Then I think you stand to have a much better case that people want commuter light rail in Southeast Michigan.
And that's going to be reflected in your council members and such as, and we're going to talk about that in a second, because there's a special thing that I know some listeners have asked us to talk about. I will say, you're talking about people using it. The projections are 66,500 passengers to use the service each year, with 14,000 passengers beginning and ending their trip in Windsor. Obviously, this is a report from the Canadian side.
I feel like that's generous.
Come on, we love our Windsor friends.
I know we do love our Windsor friends, but I feel like that's very generous. I think putting this around 50,000 a year is a bit more realistic. And listen, I could be wrong. I would use it all the time.
I think it's going to be more, but with a little different ship. So you would use it all the time. That was the thing I was going to ask you.
Yeah, I would use it all the time. I love Toronto. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. I try to go there at least once a year, obviously with some pandemic foolishness or whatever. I try to get to Toronto once a year, at least, every other year. I would definitely use this. This would make my life so much easier, because that drive to Toronto is an easy drive, but it's boring.
It would be nice to just sit there. Same thing with Chicago.
Yeah.
Or, this is going to go through a number of cities in Michigan, which I think would benefit all of them.
Yeah. You talk about the rail line that already exists. You would hit Kalamazoo, you would hit Battle Creek, you would hit Ann Arbor, you would hit Dearborn, and then going into Corktown and Detroit. So really, you get the grand tour of southern Michigan, I suppose. And I think it would be great, and so many people, I think, would get the benefit from something like this. And it could be a way that people get to go to another country, go to Toronto for the first time, because it's not the easiest place to get to if you're not driving. I think it would be a good idea, but it does have to get put into fruition. And there's still a lot of hurdles for this one to clear.
Let's follow up on the tease that I gave earlier that we need to talk about city council, because it's one of those minutia things where you like kind of get frustrated that there isn't more voice about what's happening with this. And so that's why it's like we need to talk about it here on Daily Detroit. There is a required process with the census for the city to readjust their council districts so that they're all kind of balanced by population and size. Like there's like a formula to it. I won't bore you with it. You can go look it up if you want. I'll put some resources in the show notes. But based on census numbers, there are 3 different redistricting options open. And I think it's important to talk about because your council member is important if you live in the city of Detroit. Now, the plurality of our listeners are in the city of Detroit. So we're going to spend some time talking about it. If you're not in the city of Detroit, I think it's still interesting because, each of these council districts is the size of a large suburb.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you look at some of the larger districts like, District 6 or District 3, geographically, they are bigger than some of the suburbs.
Oh, for sure.
And population-wise, they are similar to many of the suburbs around. The city of Detroit, first of all, this is caveated with the umbrella that the city of Detroit continues to lose population. Roughly, I'm rounding, but we're talking about a loss of nearly 70,000 people in between 2010 and 2020. That's a massive loss of people. And in some districts, you're talking about like District 4, it's a loss of almost 20%.
That's like almost the size of Royal Oak. Gone.
Yeah, just gone. Just imagine if Royal Oak, we just got rid of all the people who live there and just put them somewhere else in Southeast Michigan. It'd be devastating for that region. And so the redistricting efforts here from the city of Detroit and the council have to take all that into careful consideration. And in the case of districts like 3 and 4, there are large swaths of land that are going to have to be taken from other districts and added to this district in order to balance those numbers.
Let's do a Mother May I Step Back. For those who aren't familiar, and I know it's hard to talk geography in audio, but the city districts kind of work in a clockwise manner. One is the upper west. So that's where
I grew up, Northwest Side. We're talking about Old Redford, Brightmoor, Rosedale Park, that area.
Yeah, 2, then you end up to University District, Bagley, things like that. 3, you've got that like northeast side, very industrial. 4, you go over to East English Village and some of Jefferson Chalmers. 5 is a weird kind of central district that currently goes from near Belle Isle through the north end and up a little bit. And then 6th is Corktown all the way down through like Delray, the Zug, like all those areas down there.
And 7 would be the west side.
Yes, and 7 would be the west side, or as you say, down the street.
Down the street.
But the population losses are very different in the different districts. And just to be honest, like District 4 on the east side, according to these census numbers, has lost nearly 20% of its population. District 3 has lost almost 17% of its population. The only district that came out a little, not unscathed, but 2 districts that came out decent. They only lost 4 or 5%, which is still a devastating number, are districts 1 and 2. Areas of District 2 are extremely solid.
Yeah, when we're talking about District 2, you're talking about Avenue of Fashion University District. You're talking about Sherwood Forest right up there, all the parts of the city that touch Ferndale and a little bit of Oak Park up there. And, as we look at how some of these districts are being redrawn, 1 and 2 are only going to lose very small portions of their district, right? Not many people in the city are going to have to worry about, am I voting for a new person? And that's really what this is about and how it trickles down to the average person, the average listener of, my council person may not be my council person moving forward after these lines are redrawn.
And there's some considerations where council members live. There's already been some raised by Scott Benson, because he would be drawn in one of these proposals out of his district. One of the proposals would actually shift a bunch of University District to another district. There's just a whole bunch of things with that. The 3 proposals are based on basically 3 general ideas. 1, the first proposal basically says, all right, major roads, this is what we're gonna say is our first look. We're going to go on the major roads. Proposal 2 is going to put the equal number of people over boundaries. So you're going to have more jagged boundaries. You're going to have some changes so that you can have the same amount of people. Then Proposal 3 keeps District 5 mostly the same. It's kind of a central district with some edits, and then adjusts things around that. It is something where it is going to be interesting to see this process. I know the folks on the east side, I believe the East Side Community Network people, are working on their own proposal because they have a lot of, by the census numbers, they have a lot of population loss to manage. And we need to also think about these districts where people live because this is an issue with the bus system, everything else. Like a lot of the bus system for a long time was based on the old streetcar lines for a different population set and where people lived. Things have changed on the east side and across the city on where people live and where they congregate. So having districts that actually reflect those communities, that, you know, the boundaries are drawn in such a way that you have neighborhoods served by a district or a council person that you can then go to and hold responsible, I think is a pretty big priority. And one discussion that I will have, and I think you want to mention it too, is none of these proposals make any changes to downtown. And I know there are a number of listeners and other people who are like, hey, why is it that downtown Detroit and Midtown and all that is split in two right down the middle?
Yeah, it's really weird, especially with downtown, that it be split. Listen, I don't know if that has anything to do with the distribution of power amongst city council members or anything like that.
You got places with the ability to write big checks on both sides of Woodward.
Yeah, you know, for me, it just seems logistically that it would make sense to have all of downtown sit in one district. Right now, it's currently split between, I believe, District 6 and 5. And right now, you would think 375 would be the border. Like, you would think, like, District 6 would go all the way up to 375, but it doesn't. It like stops at a Bobian or something like that. It's a really weird boundary.
And I also wonder why we don't have something that's drawn around where it's contiguous where people live and work and do things. If you live downtown, whether you're on one side of Bobian, whatever street is, because it zigzags depending on which proposal, your common cause is going to be with things near you with the place you live. And this may be unpopular, but downtown is a neighborhood too, as Midtown is a neighborhood.
Absolutely.
I don't think personally they deserve to be split apart like that. And I think that we should think about that in every population center in Detroit, because I think about what's going on in Corktown versus what's going down in Southwest. Those are different communities that I think need different representation.
Yeah, I would be interested to see if anybody puts forth a proposal that takes sort of those neighborhoods into consideration.
Because this proposal is from the law department. So
Yes.
And it looks like it was written by a law department.
It does. The thing for me is that, you know, proposal 1, which focuses on sort of street barriers, I think that's how a lot of Detroiters think. They think in our large sort of north-south boundaries and our east-west boundaries. You know, you think a neighborhood stops at 7 Mile, or a neighborhood stops at Greenfield, or a neighborhood stops at Conant or whatever. And, you know, I think that makes sense geographically for a lot of people, but it may not be the best answer for the population loss.
Okay, so here's something weird about this. So listeners know, Engineer Randy lives in the West Village. I live in the North End. We have the same council person. Also, by the way, I will note, and this is no shade against anyone, we didn't have any choice on our council member.
Yeah.
They ran unopposed, but we are in the same council district, though I think we have some differing needs between the North End and, like, I go to Indian Village and West Village and all that, but, like, that isn't my concern group every day. Like, I go there to visit and shop, but, like, it's not integrated with my thing. Do we even... This is a crazy idea. Other cities sometimes have smaller districts, more like an alderman system in Chicago. Yeah. Do we need to consider some sort of change in the future like that?
Not with the population loss.
I say not with a full-time council.
I think not with a full-time council and not with the population loss. I think if we were sitting at, you know, 1 million plus, where, you know, each of these neighborhoods is dealing with, you know, 200,000 people, 300,000 people, I think an alderman system works. I think for right now, we just don't even have the infrastructure to be able to deploy a alderman system or a more localized structure, because right now, there kind of is no, who is the person that goes and serves just Rosedale? Who how do we do that?
There
how
is
do
the
we
neighborhood
pay?
city hall concept.
There's neighborhood city hall,
but that's on
but
the mayor's administration side, not
exactly.
council.
Exactly. You know, and I'm not trying to make this sound nefarious, but they serve at the whims of the mayor and at the whims of the city, and not necessarily
as they should as an administration appointee.
Right, and not necessarily at the whims of the neighborhood, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I just don't think we're at that point yet, and I think the bigger thing as we pull away and just get back to the 30,000 foot view of this whole issue is I'm looking at District 3 and 4, and I'm saying, clearly this is where we need to apply a lot of attention. The Northwest side is a little bit more stable. It's clearly has a little bit more going for it. People aren't leaving those neighborhoods. But when we're looking at the Deep East,
is that just because you're a child of Brightmoor?
No, it's not just because I'm a child. Listen, let me just be perfectly
honest. Is the
honest.
Brightmoor coach going to be suspended for 3 games?
No, let me put it out here. I'm gonna be honest with you. You know, Brightmoor is not an affluent area, and so people tend to be poor. They tend to not have the ability to move. But when we're talking about areas like Old Retford and Rosedale, those people are doing a little bit better, and they're not moving. Beautiful neighborhoods, but they're not moving. So those people are staying, and that is what the data shows. So where does our attention need to be put in order to keep people in the city? Well, we got to look at where people are leaving, what is happening in those areas. As you said, Deep East, industrial, not a lot of entertainment, not a lot of retail, not a lot of development going on over there. So that's where we need to apply our pressure.
What about the theory of doubling down on winners, maybe even outside of a council district thing, saying, you know, there's a ton of stuff happening in East English Village, right? There's a ton of positive stuff, and the strategic neighborhood fund, the 10 districts, whatever, there's dollars going into that, but doubling down on what works, because is there a world where we're going to be getting back to 1 million people in 20 years?
It's hard to say and it's hard to see. I mean, I think this will depend heavily on Gen Z and Gen Alpha. The millennials have made their choice. And what I mean by that is we're split.
And I'm here.
we're split down the middle 50-50. Half of us decided to live in the suburbs. Half of us have decided to live in the city.
And you see the rise of cities across the nation.
And you're starting to see the rise of cities because the Gen X and boomers in droves moved to the suburbs, right? Continuing, you know, urban sprawl. Millennials wanted cities. I think Gen Z wants cities even more. Gen Alpha is a little bit too young to tell. We'll see. It depends on those generations. But somebody's going to have to do something with all that infrastructure in the suburbs. So now we're in a conundrum, especially in the state of Michigan. Multiple reports have been coming out talking about the infrastructure of the suburbs is becoming unsustainable. We can't continue to spread in the same way that we're spreading and expect cities to survive.
And especially with some of those inner ring suburbs, the dollars, and we talked about this with Jake Berman about his book, the dollar loop doesn't make sense in some suburbs where you've got a $150,000 house, but the street needs to be repaved. All the stuff that you need still needs to happen, but your tax rates are so low. The township system, if you go to some places in Macomb County and otherwise, that township system, there are fights for years over whether to pave something because you have to go into individual places and ask for things, as opposed to here. Yeah, we do have some challenges, don't get me wrong. But, like, there's new sidewalks going up all over the north end.
Cities have more infrastructure in place in order to service large amounts of people. That's the purpose of cities, right? I think that's where we get to a point where we potentially see 1 million people back in the city. But for a place like Detroit, and I will stand on the mountaintop of this, and this is a separate issue, but the amenities have to be figured out, the safety issue has to be figured out, and the schools have to be figured out. Until we solve those 3 issues, or at least make people feel more confident in those 3 issues, no, I don't think Detroit will ever see 1 million people again.
Look, the areas that you see increased safety, increased access to schools in the city of Detroit are going up. Straight up, right?
Straight up.
100%.
Downtown going up. District 1, not losing that many people. Guess what? It's because people can buy houses there. A concept.
All right. Well, Norris Howard, what an episode. Want to make sure that we get your feedback. 313-789-3211. Leave a voicemail. We might play it on the air. Or dailydetroit@gmail.com. We talked about 2 big topics. I'd love to hear your feelings. I know you would, Norris.
Absolutely. You know, y'all
tell us
know
that we're wrong, because we have a bunch of people who told us we're wrong about that whole power thing, but we'll talk about that in another episode.
Yeah, man. But listen, I love hearing the feedback from all of you guys. Listen, you know, none of us are infallible, but most of all, the best part about it is you have a stake and you have a voice in this too. Let yourself be heard, whether we agree with your opinion or not, man. It's really nice to hear.
With that, I'm Jairus Days.
And I'm Norris Howard.
Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.